The Last of Us is one of the most beloved video games of the last 10 years, maybe of all time. Critics and fans alike couldn't help but give across-the-board near-perfect scores to this landmark title. If you haven't played the game, you might wonder, what makes this post-apocalyptic survival zombie shooter stand out against all of its contemporaries? And while the game can be taken as a masterclass in each of its parts, all of them come together to the unique focal point that defines The Last of Us as a piece of art: the story and its characters. Let's step back a bit. You might have noticed that I called The Last of Us art. And this is a concept I would like to focus on for this video. Each art form has something that makes it distinct against other art forms. To give a simplified example, music has a unique ability to tell a story or convey things to the listener through sound, while a painting can do the same to its observer through a static visual. If video games are an art form, then what makes it special? Gameplay. Gameplay changes art from something to be observed to something that is controlled. While there are exceptions to this rule, the ability to affect what happens in art is almost always found in video games. Gameplay takes Super Mario Bros. From being some pixels running and jumping along a screen to an intense platforming challenge for a player to overcome. Now let's bring this back to the topic. Last of Us is different from most other games because, like I mentioned earlier, the focal point of the experience is the story, not the gameplay. In fact, gameplay is relatively de-emphasized in The Last of Us, and this is revealed in the game's cinematics, the sections of the game where the developers revoke your control over the situation, like cutscenes or scripted sequences, removing the gameplay from some parts of it, and making the game seem more like a movie. But this doesn't make the gameplay trivial. What we see in The Last of Us is something we don't see in a lot of games: gameplay in a supportive role. This brings me to my main points. In this video, I want to explore how exactly The Last of Us uses gameplay as one piece of telling a narrative, and I want to show that The Last of Us succeeds because of this. Since the gameplay is in servitude to the story, we have to establish what the story is before we know how the gameplay enhances it. The Last of Us takes place in a world where an infection that turns humans into mindless fungus zombies has toppled society. The game opens with the beginning of the crumbling of modern life as we follow Joel and his daughter Sarah through all the chaos.
Jimmy, I am warning you! Don't!
Tragically, Sarah ends up dying while Joel survives. Fast forward 20 years. A much older and cynical Joel's path happens to intersect with Ellie's, a young girl who is immune to the infection. He reluctantly agrees to take her on the perilous journey to a group called the Fireflies who hope to derive a vaccine from her. Amidst all these events, the real story is about the two main characters. It's about how Joel sees his lost daughter in Ellie, and how he gradually finds life in taking care of her despite all the pain in his past. It's about a once sheltered Ellie learning about the world she lives in, and how the two build a relationship in processing all of it together. Okay, we set up the story. Let's talk about the gameplay now. I find that most of the gameplay can be divided into two main categories: exploration and combat. During combat portions of the game, you're forced into situations where your enemies often have the advantage. You'll have to sneak, check your surroundings, and make your resources count when you strike. The exploration parts of the game are calm and simply have the player traversing their environment without much urgency. During exploration, the player might solve puzzles, engage in conversation, or most importantly, scrounge around for supplies. When you're exploring, you'll want to check every nook and cranny of your surroundings looking for bullets, medkits, weapon parts, and crafting materials that you will later use as tools for eliminating your enemies. Let's focus on the combat aspect of the game first. The Last of Us turns a basic cover shooter system into an intense crucible that will test your skills by spicing it up with stealth, multiple dangerous enemy types that require you to react differently, low health pools, creative problem solving, brutal takedowns, and a limited supply of resources. All of which help make the player feel the stress of combat along with Joel and Ellie. But perhaps the element that does the best job at this is the resource system. I mentioned earlier that resources give you more tools to use in combat. Proper use of these tools will grant the player more freedom in how they choose to fight. Without any resources at all, the player's options are as follows: sneak past enemies, fistfight enemies, or strangle enemies. Against fully armored gunmen or a legion of infected, any careless use of these strategies would instantly kill the player, meaning at this state, the game is at its most punishing. To succeed without resources would be an extreme test of patience and perseverance, and to most players this would be an undesirable game state to be in. By having not only a limited but meager amount of resources available, the game motivates the player to use these resources as effectively as possible to avoid having to fight without them. To demonstrate, I'd like to show some of my own gameplay from 2 successive combat encounters. In the first one, I have to push this truck down a road until it gets started without dying. A few waves of infected are about to come at me. I start with 9 shotgun shells and 1 bullet in my revolver. I do my best to fistfight the weaker runner infected to save ammo, but if the stronger clicker zombie type catches up to me, I'm done for. I find a brick on the ground, save that one for later. Beat that one up. Getting a little close to the clicker, but it's focused on Bill. Finally, I get as close as I can to the clicker with my shotgun, and push the truck a bit. Next wave, I use my revolver to soften up these first 2 runners, and the clicker isn't too close, so I have no problem finishing them off with my bare hands. I shotgun the next one and begin lining up my next shot, but I'm not close enough. I see the clicker go after Bill, so I beat that one down. And I regrettably whiff this first shot, but thankfully Bill gives me a hand. Push a little more. Last group of infected. 5 shells left. I use the brick from earlier to beat the first one down in 3 hits. Then I back up to make sure nothing sneaks up on me. And again, I whiff the first shot. But I learned my lesson and make sure to get as close as possible for the next one. So then just save Bill, pick up some ammo, and it's a mad dash to the end of the encounter. I felt pretty good about that one with 6 shells to go into the next fight with. There's a lot that goes on between now and the next fight, but to sum it up, we crash the truck and some hunters want to kill us. They rip us out of the truck. I throw some guy into broken glass, save Ellie from her assailant, and now the real encounter begins. I notice that I have about 4 enemies to deal with here, and I've got 6 shells, which is enough. But since I used my revolver ammo on those infected earlier, my options are limited to close range. I stun the first hunter with my shotgun, and decide to save ammo while finishing him off. Around the corner, this guy catches me off guard, so I panic fire once, and I misjudge the distance on the second one, which doesn't kill him, but lucky for me, there's plenty of cover from his friends. He also drops a wood plank I can use as a more effective melee. Since I still only have shotgun ammo and a melee weapon, my options remain short-ranged. I decide to wait inside the shop and utilize the cover it provides rather than risking everything by going outside. They'll eventually come in after me.
Where is this guy?
I was pretty sure no one else would see me at this point, so I use the plank on this guy, but someone does see me as a bullet whizzes over my head and I rush to cover.
Watch my over here.
Next, Ellie points out 3 more guys hopping over the bus. Now my enemies outnumber my bullets. This one rushes at me and I finally get a good shot in. Funny enough, the game reminds me I can switch my available weapons and I discover 2 more bullets in my hunting rifle that I forgot about. But I really value hunting rifle ammo and I decide not to use it until I get stuck in a really tough fight later. I see some cabinets I can open up and I get distracted looking for more supplies. I get punished with a plank to the head. Just kill this guy real quick. I'm gonna use my last 2 shells on this guy. And I'm thinking of how to deal with the last guy, and I find a brick. Perfect. He doesn't stand a chance. As you can see, Throughout every fight, the game challenges me to alternate between maximizing the usefulness of my resources and punching to save on them. The results of this system are tense battles, where each decision impacts the amount of supplies you have later. The player fights not only to achieve a desirable outcome, but also to prevent a lasting undesirable outcome. These feelings experienced by the player are mirrored by the two main characters. While the player feels pressure to land every shot at risk of starting the fight over or making future encounters more difficult, Joel feels the same anxiety, but instead the price for error is his own life. The resource system also brings a constant feeling of lack. If you're playing on a properly challenging difficulty, you'll desperately scrounge around for every medkit, bullet, or piece of tape, and still go into battles with fewer resources than you'd like. For everyone living in the world of The Last of Us, that is a constant reality. The player appreciates the importance of anything that keeps the characters from dying. For example, Bill's frustration becomes understandable when you consider that to get to him, Joel and Ellie set off all his traps and they proceed to demand a valuable car. You get why Ellie agrees to make a trade with the mysterious and potentially dangerous David in exchange for antibiotics that could save Joel's life. And while much of the same feelings can be shown during cutscenes, this seemingly small element ends up keeping you in tune with what the characters are going through in a way that has you not only feeling the pressure of managing resources, but giving you the actual ability to do so. Now, what purpose do the exploration parts of the game serve? Aside from gathering resources, which we've already discussed, this is where you can engage in optional stories and world building. I can recall on my first playthrough, I'd do my best to search for a few extra bullets, and occasionally, I'd run into a note on the ground, or I'd find something that Joel and Ellie would exchange words over. I didn't think much of them at first, but on my second playthrough I realized that these remnants of past events were critical for shaping my understanding of the world that affects our main protagonist so deeply. Instead of describing this, I'd like to show my favorite example. During the beach section of the game, Joel approaches a boat. Inside, there's the first note left by a survivor who goes by Ish. By reading this note, we learn that Ish was at sea during the initial outbreak. When he got back to land, he found society to have deteriorated and would have to try to survive on his own. By progressing further in the game, we can see that some group of people was living in these sewers that we go into at one point in time. If we look around a little more, you'll see notes left all over the place describing the rest of Ish's story. After coming back from sea, he took refuge in the sewers. At some point, he came across a family with children and was surprised that they didn't shoot him on sight. After they traded some supplies, they parted ways, but feeling the need for some companionship, Ish ventured out to find the family, and he invited them to a sewer stronghold. Evidently, they accepted because you begin to find notes that they left for each other. You even find remnants of the children who once lived there as you see toys scattered across the ground, rules written on the walls, drawings they made, and even a classroom. Nothing seems amiss until we come across a room with some words etched into the ground.
Jesus.
Later, the characters we're currently with encounter some infected and hurry out of the sewers to find perhaps what would have been Ish's most useful message.
Look at this.
Oh, are you fucking kidding me? Thanks for the warning on the other side, guys.
The final note you can find by Ish does a wonderful job at contextualizing Joel's own struggle to trust other people. In the note, Ish mentions that the infected got in because, quote, one of us forgot to shut the door, meaning the carelessness of someone he trusted not only endangered his own life, but deeply devastated his fellow survivor Susan, who lost her own children from the incident. We have a better understanding of why Joel is afraid of caring for and trusting other people, and our knowledge of his motivations as a character is enriched. But this didn't have to be packaged up in gameplay. It could have been fed to us through a cutscene or something. The special thing about the gameplay here is that the player didn't have to find any of these notes or pay attention to the remnants left in the sewers. The player controls whether they encounter this story or not, and this crucial factor is what makes it feel like Joel and Ellie are one small part of a fully realized world, instead of just a setting that revolves around them. It makes the world feel all that more realistic because in life, if you want answers, you gotta look for them yourself. A similar principle applies to the conversations you can start during exploration. Occasionally, Ellie will see or do something that will prompt Joel to start a conversation with her if you so choose, which is indicated by a symbol above her head. The exchanges they have in these instances are usually just isolated little ideas that they share with each other that would happen organically as the two of them wander around. Let's say these interactions were put in cutscenes instead. It wouldn't work because a player would get too bored watching the minutes of walking that lead up to the conversation. Or if the game skipped over the exploration and simply put in cutscenes of these isolated conversations, it would disrupt the pacing of the whole experience by teleporting from location to location where each one occurs. By keeping the player engaged with their task of looking for supplies or completing traversal puzzles, the game shows the player how Joel and Ellie interact with each other while not much goes on, further building the understanding of the two by reinforcing the main themes in a way that only gameplay could show.
Oh, creepy. Guess they took the easy way out, huh?
It ain't easy. For many, it was better than letting a clicker or a hunter do it for them. Trust me, it ain't easy.
The great thing about The Last of Us is that it never loses its focus. It embraces its identity as a video game and uses every tool it has as such to feed into the story. In a world where many plot-driven games succeed without interesting gameplay, The Last of Us shows that video games are not a secondary medium to other art form, and that if used properly, gameplay can tell a story in a special way no other medium can.